You said we plotted the header. Yeah, I think we should plot this part. We can maybe tell people there are still seats. There's still actually quite a lot of seats. Go for
Right, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon to the first talk in the new machine learning and physics series. My name is Micha and I helped a bit to organize this, together with Professor Peter Braam, who will be giving the first talk today. Now, the series will be broadcast on YouTube, and I would like to welcome the viewers who are joining us remotely, as well as encourage them to ask questions during the talk in the comment section of the video, and we'll read them out at the end. Now, please welcome Professor Peter Braam.
Right, well, thank you very much, first of all, for coming to the lecture, but secondly, for having me over in Oxford to visit here for almost as much as I'd like to, so that's really very nice. Today I want to talk about machine learning and scientific computing, and this is sort of, to some degree, an introduction to the whole seminar series, which Micha and I have jointly organized. But it is also with my sort of particular focus. Let me tell you just a little bit about me, because I have had a sort of unusual career, I think. I started as a mathematician and actually worked in the university for 15 years here. It was meant to be a one-week visit, but it took a little bit longer to finish up. And so then eventually I left and entered the computer business world, mostly in America, and I started to work on scientific computing in the very early days when not so many people were doing this, and did what people do in America, startup companies and that sort of thing. And gradually I got to work with many of the world's biggest simulation labs, sometimes in universities, but also very big places like maybe CERN or Lawrence Livermore National Lab and so on. And I interacted with the compute companies quite a lot. 5 years or 6 years ago, I started to work with the SKA telescope people in Cambridge. I wanted to get out of business and do some more academic work, but I still work mostly on computing. And Ian Shipsey and I organized a seminar in London to talk about AI at CERN and the SKA, and then he sort of said, why don't you come here for a while? So we quickly decided that having a seminar like this might be useful in the department, and I think your presence here confirms that at least there's interest in it. So machine learning for physics is growing phenomenally fast. It's totally impossible, I think, to keep up at the moment with all the developments. That, I think, is a challenge for everyone, and I personally know even less about it than you do, probably. So I'm a computer scientist or a technologist and trained as a mathematician. I'm in fact not really a physicist at all, and also not at all a machine learning specialist. So I've tried to avoid saying too much about things that I don't know about. But be assured, the other 7 lectures should mostly be about physics, yeah, and most are on experimental physics, but some on theoretical. But computer science and mathematics are very important for machine learning, and so what I'm trying to do is give you sort of some perspectives of how we interact with it and what I think are important things. I'm happy to answer short questions as we go along. I also hope that you influence my perspective on this by harassing me over tea and saying you got it all wrong. That's totally fine. So let's start looking at what physics and machine learning, what sort of concepts one can discern. So on the left side of this slide, I'm sort of identifying 4 key words that are important here. Inference means using a machine learning model to get some kind of an answer, a trained one. So it can become a useful tool to make some sort of prediction. And the blue color is a guideline because we will have a diagram in a moment where inference is blue. Training is very important for machine learning. You all know that these networks have to be trained with good examples and bad examples often, and that data comes from multiple sources, can be experimental data or data generated by computers. The inference data, by the way, is always computed data. It's never measured data. It's by definition created by a machine learning program. Traditional scientific practice, I've just left it black. Things like doing mathematics or numerical analysis or something like that, or old-style simulation. And then green are the machine learning approaches. And I have so far discerned 4 aspects of this, but I think I didn't see anybody else classifying this, and there might well be things that I've missed and so on. One important practice is to work on sensor data. So for example, take signals from CERN detectors or signals in a radio telescope, make an image out of it, and that's called processing sensor data, and machine learning is proven to be very powerful there. A second use of machine learning for physics is to assist with simulation in multiple forms. And so we're seeing that machine learning can be much more efficient and can also refine simulations. And I will be giving somewhat more detail in this talk about simulation and the traditional ways of data for physical examples. But it's also used for experimental discovery. So machine learning is, I think, a key element in analyzing, for example, astronomical images, or other data streams of all kinds, and, for example, looking for something special that you haven't seen before. So you're trying to find a discovery in existing experimental data, or actually a discovery by analyzing simulation data. I'll give a beautiful example of that. There's also quite a lot of work happening where machine learning is even used to do theoretical discoveries, and so to assist computations that at the moment are impossible. They're too long, and somehow by working through a lot of examples, training a machine learning model can work. So in a diagram, you get roughly the following, that on the right side here, we see experimental data, and I've subclassified that in sensor data. So these are the measurements that are created. And then there's usually some intermediate product that comes like after pre-processing. For example, images from a telescope are pre-processed, or transients are pre-processed. CERN triggers are pre-processors. There are lots of things that go from raw sensor data to scientific data. And then the scientific data is analyzed further to make real discoveries, and these are usually very refined pieces of data that refer to some kind of physical or mathematical law or some unique phenomenon. On the left side, there's simulation data, and so this is all computer generated, and there's lots of it. So simulation data can be sensor data, like again, simulated sensor data can be simulated scientific data, and so on. There's lots of it. And it is done simulation at different kinds of level of fidelity. So there are conceptual simulation data that is often less precise but easy to make, and then there can be very high fidelity data that is very mathematically derived from laws in physics and mathematics. So the blue arrows are the inference arrows. Where can you use that machine learning model? And what you see for each of the 4 green spots, we have 1 blue arrow. So sensor data, for example, makes scientific data out of sensors. And when you look at the simulation area, you will be creating some form of simulation data through inference. The training data seems to be coming from all kinds of sources. Yeah, so people train models not just with experimental data, but sometimes with simulated data. And you see the red arrows to get this training data into the practices all over the place. Yeah, it comes from both experimental and from simulated data. So this is sort of an overview of what is going on here. And we'll be seeing in our seminar series examples of each of these 4 areas, each of the 4 green areas. So I've quickly given here a sort of an overview of the first few lectures. You can find them on the web. Here we won't go into detail, but we have stuff about sensor data, we have experimental discovery, and we have some discussions of simulation. We have, towards the end, 2 talks about theoretical discoveries, one in string theory, and I think one is almost mathematics. That will be your talk in the last week of the seminar. Yeah? So this is the probably not covering everything that you hope for, but I think we have a very good set of speakers. So let's start looking in a little bit more detail then at machine learning and simulation. Yeah, and so this has been looked at quite a lot, and people have tried to organize this. So before we do that, simulation and so-called high-performance computing became a huge business area in the sort of first decade of this century. It started to become mainstream around 1995 to 2000. And by 2015, the entire industry is involved in it. So if you build a cycle tire these days, you will be simulating it, yeah, and probably even a teacup. Some of it is solving differential equations, but there are lots of other simulations going on, like Monte Carlo simulations and statistical analyses and so on. Yeah, so there's the big data paradigm lives there too, and it's a fairly big industry, not huge. 50 billion is a good size industry, but it's not enormous. But it's old. Yeah, machine learning is quite young, and it's already bigger than HPC. It's focused to some degree on a subset of the mathematical problems, because all the machine learning problems are, just a subset of a broader class of mathematical problems. And the maturity of this software and new hardware framework for machine learning is growing at unprecedented rates. Yeah, and I will show you examples where the machine learning community is a factor 100 ahead of the remainder of the computing community. Yeah, so it is really a lot of opportunity there. So from a conceptual level, you can wonder then, what is the relation between this simulation business or high-performance computing and machine learning? And there's a well-known thought leader in big data called Geoffrey Fox at Indiana, who has tried to classify this year in a paper. And so he distinguishes in how machine learning can help HPC and how HPC can help machine learning. Yeah, you see that in these acronyms in green. And then he subdivides each of these classes. Yeah, and so machine learning for HPC means enhance the HPC methods with a form of machine learning. And the simplest one is perhaps to just say replace it. Yeah, so instead of solving a differential equation with step-by-step Euler style or finite element style solutions, yeah, maybe you can just train the network to see what the outcome would be. Yeah, and that's called a surrogate. And it's the first one here in the list. But there are other things, namely refining the HPC methods is another very important thing, or searching through the results. HPC for ML is the opposite. How can simulation help machine learning? And it's much more traditional. HPC is all about big computers, yeah, and so they want to help the machine learning community, and it's, so to some degree a little bit boring, yeah, it is just can you do it faster, yeah, which is what HPC has always been about. So in my lecture today, the orange aspects on this slide, I have some example of in the coming slides. Yeah, and I'm going to take you through a few. So why would you look at these two things? So HPC is an old subject, and a lot of limits have now been encountered and are very difficult to overcome. So in particular, something called adaptive mesh refinement. You may sort of feel immediately what this is. If you have like a shock wave or a turbulent flow, there will be certain areas where you have to do very precise simulation for it to be sensible, whereas other areas might be very calm laminar flow. And the adaptive mesh would do this refined simulation automatically. These problems have been stuck for 30 years on communication performance problems, and there's no, except for machine learning, there's no hope that it will improve. Yeah, and so there's a good example of an opportunity to come with completely new methods. On the other side, the HPC for ML, I already mentioned, HPC just has the biggest supercomputer, so nothing so new. So we'll mostly be looking at how can you use machine learning to help simulation. So more specifically, surrogates. So surrogates are the machine learning algorithms that replace a simulation. Yeah, and I will give one example of this in a little bit of detail done by people at the Flatiron Institute in New York, very beautiful story. And a second example to show you one of the most complex projects that I found using this, because it's impressive how much data and computing is being saved and moved around there. Enormous opportunity here to help simulations with machine learning. After that, we want to transition to a relatively short discussion of how a mathematician may look at the things that we have discussed, namely particularly the surrogates, like what are they mathematically, what questions are open, because almost all the questions appear to be open still. There are only a few answered, and I think it's maybe interesting to see how a mathematician may look at that. Towards the end, we're becoming a little more relaxed and start to talk about big computers and pictures and so on, and we'll see how you can run simulations very, very fast on machine learning equipment and with machine learning software. So, by the way, I am really responsible for very little of the content except organizing it. Yeah, so there's a lots of stuff here from other people and not really much more of my own work. So the problem that we will first look at is to predict structure formation in the early cosmos. So this is looking at a cloud of particles with some irregularities relatively shortly after the Big Bang and letting it evolve to perhaps form shapes like galaxies. So the sample of this study here was 10,000 simulations. Although I'm not 100% sure, but the paper said that it was created in actually something like half an hour or a few minutes or so. So we wouldn't call this very big data in the industry. Yeah, it's relatively quickly to generate these simulations. On the other hand, I don't quite trust that number. Now, a very important question in this problem is we don't have experimental measurements. So how do you train a model here to learn anything at all? You have to use a traditional high fidelity simulation. Yeah, if you don't do that, you don't have an input to train the machine learning model. Yeah, and so the ground truth here is an expensive simulation called FastPM, Fast Particle Mesh. It's a relatively recent algorithm. So the model that is created, I will show you a picture of it in a moment, is created as follows. So they look at this body of particles in the early universe, and these particles have an initial condition, namely where is their initial location and what is their initial velocity. And this is a relatively simple, nothing very quantized or anything, just a classical mechanics problem for very, very many bodies. There is an old approximation created by Zeldovich, who was a famous physicist in Russia, which basically says, why don't you just follow a straight trajectory for this particle? And if you think about it, it's almost like the light ray problem, and the answers are already very, very complicated. Yeah, because these light rays, they can have, focal points and so on. So you see lots of complicated things already happening by just using the linear approximation. Now, the interesting thing is that when particles take this initial motion, at some point they get close, and then interesting things start happening. They start rotating around each other. And it turned out that something called a UNet could actually learn that rotation motion and get a very accurate description of a much more refined simulation in that way, by training. So this model is not a one-step algorithm from the input to the output. They actually combine a very simple traditional simulation with a machine learning step to deal with these final aspects after the linear motion has happened. So this model is very accurate. It's almost indistinguishable from or better than other models, which you'll see in a picture in a moment. And it's 5 times faster than the refined model, is what the final paper says. I heard very different numbers when I talked with these guys, but I didn't get an answer in time to correct this. So here is a picture of that UNet. So a UNet is a convolutional network that first samples down. So it takes little convolutions of 3 by 3 cells or so, and then it derives information, and then it samples out again, so it scales back out. But there's also some pass-through from the beginning to the end mixed into this. And this is then applied in this study to a little cube. But I've never seen such a big cube, but other people might be used to this. So this is 10 to the power 11 cubic light years. Yeah, this must be a really decent part of the universe, I think. I don't really know. And it also shows how shamefully small the simulation model is, because they built cubes for space, only 32 in each of the directions. Yeah, that for this scale, it looks like a rather coarse approximation. Yeah, to say the very least. Try to put some humans in there with thoughts and so on. Yeah? So the input to the D3M model, is the output of that Zeldovich thing, and then you always need a loss function to train things, so you want to say how far away is the fast PM solution from this D3M outcome, and they just take the mean square of the different fields, so these fields are the displacement fields of these particles, and a very simple norm is the function. So here's a picture. So on the left is the ground truth, so we don't really know what happened in the universe, so the fast PM simulation is the ground truth. And then we have 3 approximations, the Zeldovich one, a linear perturbation theory, and the D3M. And the interesting thing to take away from this is that the errors are kind of in red. And what you will see is that Zeldovich has lots of red points, which is particularly when the mass gets close, it fails to capture the rotation. Second order linear perturbation theory has fewer, but D3M has almost none. It's really a very good model. And so this is, I think, a very simple and very beautiful example of a surrogate. So D3M is a surrogate for the multi-particle motion that is simulated here. And 5 times performance gain is maybe modest, but it's still, if it's expressed in dollars, 80% of your money. So good. So I have a few suggestions and questions about this. So first of all, it is a little awkward that we had to tinker both with the Zeldovich approximation and with the neural net. There must be some kind of neural network that includes that linear motion. I'm not an expert on finding neural networks, and this is, by the way, sort of intuitive thing at the moment that some people are very good at, but it is a little awkward to combine two models instead of having one. Secondly, there are 10 to the power 7 parameters in this UNet that you're training, 10 million. Yeah, so that's very small compared to the light years. It's still a decent number. Yeah, what is not at all taken into account is that this is just classical mechanics, which is invariant under translations. Yeah, that's the preservation of momentum. And so the group that does that actually reduces these 10 million parameters to less than 100. So I have wondered, like, why aren't they searching in the invariant evolution models? Because surely particle motion is invariant under and preserves momentum. Yeah, and so I think what these questions show you is how early this discipline is. Yeah, this is brand new. The paper appeared a month or two ago. Yeah, and very obvious things are all good for further study. Okay, so the next example I'd like to give is at the extreme other end of complexity, I think. So there's a concept called inertial confinement fusion, which is to ignite a plasma into a fusion reaction. And Lawrence Livermore National Lab has a huge facility for this called the National Ignition Facility, where they simulate this and they have lasers to actually ignite plasma, and they have lots of computers to model it. So let me tell you a little bit about this. This Lawrence Livermore was a lab that early on built nuclear bombs, but there was a test ban treaty, and then they stopped building bombs. They could only simulate them. That happened in the maybe 1980s or something like that. And the two pillars of what they call the stockpile stewardship program, which is basically to sort of preserve the capabilities to still build nuclear weapons without exploding them, rests on supercomputers, and really these were the biggest supercomputers in the world, year after year after year, yeah, until finally the Chinese took over, I think, for a short time. But the National Ignition Facility is an equally impressive or more impressive accomplishment. I think it's a 3 soccer field large laser institute. And I have some movies. Now, let's hope that when we click on this, so there's a 1-minute show here how that NIF thing actually works. So let's see if we can play that, because it looks kind of cool. So it can go full screen maybe. I'm lucky. So let's play this for roughly a minute.
In total, the energy of the laser beams is increased a quadrillion times as they travel more than 1,500 meters from the master oscillator room to the target chamber. In the switch yard, the parallel bundles of beams are rearranged into a conical configuration. That's so they can be focused into the center of the target chamber to the target assembly. The assembly holds the spherical fuel pellet containing hydrogen. Here you see the 8 beams split into 4 orbitals each. One group traveling up and other traveling down, heading for equal entry ports on the target chamber. Finally, the beams transfer rockets such as infrared laser light to ultraviolet. The beams that converge on the 10-millimeter target assembly called the whole one, generating a bath of X-rays. This causes the tiny target sphere to be totally ignited in a controlled, self-sustaining fusion reaction.
But by the way, I've been to Livermore quite a few times, and to the other weapon labs too. I've never heard any music. I just did want to tell you one other thing that did happen to me. So first of all, you can only get in there if you're a United States citizen. Otherwise, it's an act of Congress or so to allow you in. So I walked with somebody else between these racks of computers somewhere, and I saw one of these green displays, and I thought, boy, let me quickly look, maybe my own software is showing up here. So I turned my head sideways, and out of nowhere jumped some guy with a huge gun, and he said, "Don't look at that." So that's what Lawrence Livermore is really like. The next movie is a little bit more serious, so by the way, we had 6 movies going at the same time a minute ago, so I have to be very careful here too. Okay, so so we want to go back here. So this shows you the simulation of this little pellet that you saw explode at the end of the music. This is sort of, I think, scientifically actually very interesting to look at this for a moment. So it's very, very short, it's only a few seconds. I will try to play it like 2 times or so, and stop it so that you can see what is going on. So first of all, let's make it big. So watch it. They're going to show you 3 simulations, but it's probably sort of a little bit secret, so they don't want to show you too much.
Just the moment the shot goes off.
So I managed to press the pause button for 3 seconds. This has never happened before. So look at the description of the simulations. On the left, it says 1 CPU, 5 minutes runtime. And it looks actually rather simple there. You know, you might almost think, wow, that's a nice symmetric solution of some plasma equation, yeah, and wonderful. You know, this way we can build things quite easily if it behaves like that. Then in the middle, you see 1500 CPUs, so that's a pretty big machine. It's bigger than what Oxford has probably at the moment, running for a day, yeah, and the world has changed, yeah, it behaves in a very complicated way. This is on a world-class computer on the right, a month of runtime, yeah, so they call these capability machines that are used for very long, very detailed situations. And what you see now is that it's very, very complicated, yeah, the tiniest irregularity in the beginning and rounding errors and so on introduce these automatically. Change the picture completely from left to right. So these are simulations that are extremely costly, as you can see, and where the results are probably not very reliable either. Yeah, the accuracy of this is, I think, questionable. Okay, so now oh wow, this is really amazing. So remember that what we saw is that that pellet in the middle, which they want to explode, is actually contained in a little thing called the Hohlraum. I think the German word just means a little open room, as far as I can tell. And the simulation on the outside is very, very complicated, as you can see, because all these laser beams are getting into this Hohlraum. Yeah, and then the pure pellet simulation is also complicated. That's what we just saw. Yeah, but it's incomparably easier than dealing with the whole Hohlraum. Yeah, which has this very irregular sort of structure. So these are differential equations that are plasma physics, maybe even multiphysics, both hydrodynamics and all kinds of material properties probably. And so there are things here like shock waves, turbulence, yeah, multiphysics with coupling of many equations, yeah, and as I said, the errors are quite high. So the amount of data here is tens of petabytes. Yeah, so these were the largest storage systems that existed until the cloud companies took over, and they dig through that, and yet they said, let's try machine learning. And so there's a group where I know somebody, Brian Spears. He's the last author on this paper here that made one very interesting discovery. He's maybe the group leader of this simulation computational effort. So they found, for example, that the spherical one is not the right shape. And they did this by machine learning. So the real simulation took very, very long, but the machine learning one, in this case, ran 1,000 times faster. So instead of a month, they were down to a few hours or maybe even minutes to create lots and lots of examples. And they suddenly found, wow, if we have an oval shape, we get much more stable explosions. Yeah, and this is quite important, not just for bombs, but also for fusion reactors. So a second very interesting thing that they try to do or have done, and this is discussed in a PhD thesis that I quoted on the right bottom, really, I think an excellent thesis that is brand new, but on the web somewhere. They try to break this simulation into the two parts that I described. First, what is called the pre-shot or the shot simulation that brings the energy to the little pellet in the middle, and then the post-shot one that only looks at the implosion that happens afterwards. And to some degree, they're more interested in that last phase, and they wanted to refine that model. And so this is very similar to human vision in a way, or human reading. So when you can read the Roman alphabet, you can then subsequently learn multiple languages. Yeah, they may all be written in that alphabet. Or human vision, once you recognize boundaries and shapes, you can then maybe learn to detect cancer cells or particular stars. And this is exactly the sort of thing that they did here. They took the later layers in their networks and refined just those layers. So these are the doctor layers or the language layers. Yeah, they are not the basic capabilities that were very stable in the net. They were the final layers. So this is an example where you have to train half of a network. So a key question is, how do you find that data that is the beginning sort of the pellet part? Yeah, because maybe you have to somehow extract that. And so the thesis discusses various both computer and experimental techniques to get exactly that as training data, and they got quite a good improvement on the accuracy of these simulations. From talking to academics and talking with this lab, my impression is that this lab is miles ahead of many university attempts to do machine learning for physics. Keep an eye on them. Yeah, and I'm just saying this as an outsider. I'm not a physicist, but I have the impression these guys really know what they're doing, and there's a lot to learn. And although much of it is secret, there's also an awful lot on the web at the same time. Yeah, so it's a very good source. Good. On to some mathematics. So what is really going on here from a mathematician's perspective? So one of the first questions that comes up here is, what are these model choices? Why do we have units here, this kind of base and search there, and so on and so on and so on? There are whole families of these things. And I think there's a huge challenge here. Turn this into a systematic discipline. At the moment, machine learning experts have a feeling for this that is, I think, being increasingly articulated, but it's nothing like take a differential equation, do a finite element approximation. Yeah, those are very clear steps for which the mathematics is very clear. Here, there's an intuitive knowledge that we don't have. Secondly, the approximations that we see in simulation are directly related to mathematics. They are simply evolution of differential equations or something else. The machine learning ones appear to be one-shot operators from the beginning to the end. What are these operators mathematically? Yeah, there's lots of applications of this, yeah, applied mathematics and application in physics, for example. There's no good mathematical understanding what is really happening here. Similarly, same spirit of question is scale. So what we saw is that this convolutional network for the cosmology took these voxel cubes, only 32 per 200 million light years or something, yeah? That indicates that the resolution of that model is quite coarse, yeah? So somehow, if you look at a detail inside a voxel, that can't be captured. There are numerical methods now that I mentioned earlier already that do adapt to scale automatically. Yeah, these adaptive mesh methods are precisely there to deal with scale at different scales automatically by detecting it. I think that Mia told me that this is already underway. Yeah, there are apparently now machine learning methods appearing that adapt to scale automatically. This is important, yeah, because otherwise you get sort of limited methods. Second sort of question is that neural net for cosmology was a very simple one. You know, the input was just the cosmos, yeah, 1 voxel per input, yeah, with a speed vector in it. What happens if we make very many inputs? Do we somehow get a continuum limit of this thing? Yeah, it feels like statistical physics where you have individual particle models going towards a continuous model. Yeah, and a lot of discoveries were made there in dealing with phase transitions and so on. Yeah, and so the sort of questions here is, as this network gains width and depth, yeah, do the solutions really approximate the mathematical solutions, and are there phase transitions? Yeah, what are the continuous limits of these neural nets? I don't think mathematicians have a good answer at the moment. The last example of a mathematical question is the following. So the evolution model of the cosmology was very, very simple. Yeah, it just went from one moment in time to another moment in time. So you can compose that just as in mathematics. Yeah, the evolution of a differential equation takes you from one point to another, and if you then follow the flow again, you go to the next time. So there is, with the neural networks, the same possibility. You could apply one network for the first time step and then a network for the second time step, but then you have a network now that has double the depth. Yeah, maybe the same input and output. So we have an algebra structure on the networks, yeah, one that is actually rather similar to ones that you see in quantum physics and conformal field theories. So what is this space of neural networks? Are there algebraic properties like this and maybe geometric properties that are really important? Yeah, composition of flow is maybe a simple thing, but it's also a very important issue in mathematics. So these are some sort of pure mathematics perspectives on the elements of machine learning, and I couldn't find anything about this. So that's, again, perhaps indicating that it's early days. Okay, we're getting towards the last few sections of the talk. So this is about running, using machine learning to run simulations, yeah, and so there are software aspects here and hardware aspects, and I'll first talk about some software examples and then about some hardware examples. Simulation software at the moment is written often in C++, and it's a horror. Yeah, it is unmaintainable, and it's lengthy, complicated, and so on. Things like TensorFlow have evolved at a rate that is incomparable. Yeah, there's so much money being thrown at it and so much effort made to connect both the users and all the systems very well that you begin to wonder, like, isn't that a much better system to use? So a group at boy, I hope I didn't remove the reference. No, it's still there. A group that has worked with some universities in Sweden, I think, and Oak Ridge National Lab. Oak Ridge, by the way, is not a weapons lab; it's a sort of science lab, but it's also very big. And there probably are also guns there, but I've also never heard music. Yeah, so they started to look at standard benchmarks, and I'll show you in a minute a few of them for HPC or simulation calculations. Like, for example, how well can you communicate between different nodes, or how quickly can you do a matrix multiplication or a Fourier transform or a conjugate gradient solution to a numerical problem. And so they came actually to some very nice conclusions. First of all, they found that the programmability of TensorFlow was incredibly good. They created for each of these examples programs that were just a few hundred lines long, much shorter than what had been done before. They also found that the so-called remote DMA transport for data is extremely good. I'll show you about that in just a minute. And that it scaled quite well with the number of processors. So these were really encouraging things. They also found a few things that need fixing. So I know that this room is probably in love with Python, because I talk enough to physicists to know that they like that. Python is great, but it's also a horror in many ways. For example, it's very, very slow, really, yeah, if you come down to it. And the slicing and dicing in a Fourier transform didn't go very well when they did this. Yeah, they needed Python for that. TensorFlow couldn't do it better. And also the usual problem is that some of the so-called locking to deal with data arriving at the same time was very poor. The next steps that haven't been taken yet, and this is why I'm saying this is not a production-ready study, so you can try, but it's probably too early. So they didn't really compare with the true benchmarks yet, and I think because they're losing very badly due to these little things on the left that need fixing. Yeah, and if they fix those, they can compare with the HPC benchmarks, and they should be able to get quite good results, I think. They also didn't scale this on large clusters. Yeah, I just told you about this Livermore cluster with 10,000 computers. That's becoming the sort of norm for large computers, and you need to test on these large platforms. Another thing that hasn't really been done is TensorFlow specific hardware. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here's a picture of TensorFlow, and somebody in this department told me that they've never seen anything like this before about TensorFlow. So when you write a TensorFlow application, you're probably not even using this top layer, which is the so-called API to TensorFlow. There are now things like Keras and so on that make it very easy to make models. And so it's, again, a huge evolution to connect this to what people want to do. But below it, a lot of things happen. So in particular, when multiple computers are involved, they need to communicate. And Google has something called Google Remote Procedure Calls. The simulation community has MPI, which is the famous sort of C++ framework these days for high-performance computing. And then RDMA is the raw best protocol you can get. Yeah, and so the highest performance software that you write, you would write directly with RDMA primitives. On the right, you sort of see that Google RPC and MPI actually are not too different when evaluated on these benchmarks. And RDMA is like 2 orders of magnitude faster. This is pretty important, yeah, because many simulations are blocked on communication, and to find that this is a really important driver to have, yeah, and not so many people will be running it, is, I think, a beautiful and important discovery to help with computing problems. So here's an example of the implementation. So they took a huge matrix, one that you have to break up in pieces and put one piece on every computer. That's called tiling. So the matrix for these, for example, these plasma problems, I forget the exact numbers, but I think the linear dimensions are on the size of roughly 100,000 by 100,000 at the minimum, scaling to 100 million by 100 million. And this means that you may need thousands of computers to just have little blocks. Yeah, and then the multiplication algorithm becomes kind of a mess, because you can maybe multiply 2 blocks here, but then you have to move them all around before you can multiply the next. Yeah, and so that's the sort of thing that happens in these simulation programs. And TensorFlow makes that very, very easy to program, and it did very well. It gave very high performance, although it wasn't compared with a sort of official benchmark from the HPC community. Here's, if you have done some TensorFlow programming, you should recognize a few words like worker, dataset, and mathmul is the TensorFlow operation, yeah, and the FIFO-Q and so on. These are all TensorFlow primitives. So the more complicated algorithms might involve things like the following: that you have a queue and you put multiple things in it, but then you have to wait. Yeah, and this is a sort of standard problem that is a little bit harder to solve, because you have to sort of watch for completion of something before you continue. Another more complicated issue with Fourier transforms is that the numerical analysis of Fourier transforms is very, very interesting. They take, for example, the powers of 2 lying inside an interval, and so they pick up things at 2 and 4 and 8. So they grab very irregular data out of an array. That's called slicing here. And the slicing is in TensorFlow was a little limited, but yet it wasn't difficult to program. It was much shorter than the C programs that exist. So encouraging. Perhaps much more encouraging is the last topic I want to go over, which is hardware. So there are dozens of companies at the moment making machine learning hardware. And what I'll quickly show you is that the capability of this hardware might be a factor 100 ahead of what we have for simulation at the moment. So a good example is, or one of the few examples that's really in use, is the so-called TPU, the tensor processor from Google. It's a PCI card that you can put in the PCI bus, and it has custom chips on the PCI card. And they also build clusters. So on the right you see something, they call it a pod. They didn't want to use the old words there. So the pod has 256 of these nodes. You can actually run TensorFlow within a few minutes. If you go to the tutorial, you get free time on this, and it was amazingly simple to get something going. I was astonished that it didn't take the whole night. Within an hour you can have something working. The TPU chip is overcoming huge problems in existing hardware. So in existing hardware, you've probably heard of registers and caches and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of data movement between registers and the logic for example, addition or multiplication or that sort of thing. Every time you have to move the data back and forth. The construction that these chips have is to avoid that data movement for specific operations, like a matrix operation. You have to take that row and multiply it down, 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 down. And so they don't send it to any registers. They just send it from one piece of logic to the next piece of logic to the next piece of logic without back and forths. And this is called a systolic array. The idea goes back to the 1980s. It didn't latch on then, so it's been around forever, and it makes a huge difference. So these systolic arrays, there are a few of them in every TensorFlow chip. So let me skip this slide, it's kind of complicated and it's getting late and so on. So here's a TPU card, one of these things I showed you. So it has one card, has 4 chips. Each chip has 4 of these matrix multiply units. And the memory bandwidth of that card is 5 terabytes per second, which is almost impossible to buy at the moment from a computer. You would have to spend like $50,000, and this card will cost Google a few $100s, to give you an impression of the cost of this thing. The flops of this card are quite competitive with a GPU. They are 100 teraflops per second is about the highest end GPU you can purchase. Within a computer, they actually put 4 of these cards, and now we have half a petaflop of computation in one computer. It's only 10 years ago or so that the Department of Energy said, could we get that 1 petaflop in a rack? And now they have it in one computer, just a little one, like an ordinary box. So a pod has 256 of these computers, and if you just multiply these numbers by 256, you get a 100 petaflop computer with 5 petabytes per second of bandwidth. So before we sort of do some economics about how valuable this is, let's just go back to what we discussed. So a key thing in getting performance is shown here at the bottom, namely, so all these chips have a clock, and these clock cycles are on the order of a nanosecond to maybe the order of 100 nanoseconds, depending on how good your chip is. So, and the question is, how many multiplications or computations can you do in one clock cycle? And so for an ordinary CPU, that's determined by the number of cores. So if you have 3 cores in your, or 4 cores in a modern Apple notebook, you can do 4 steps in one clock cycle, 4 operations. If you have so-called vector units, you can maybe on the order of a factor 100 more. So vector units are there for things like matrix multiplication, but also things that happen on the screen, you know, where you have an array of pixels or something like that. Yeah, the vector units help a lot. GPUs multiply that by another factor of 100. Yeah, they have lots and lots of cores at the same time, and so they have around 10,000 instructions in one clock cycle. The TPU got it up another factor 10. Yeah, so this is quite impressive to suddenly have a 10 times advance. Yeah, the GPU is a revolution, and the TPU may be the next one. So, you know, what you can really say about this, 256 nodes for 5 petabytes of bandwidth and 100 petaflops is what we saw. That's pretty much what is called a top 5 machine. Yeah, there is a list of supercomputers, and this machine would be like, depending on how you measure it, would be very high on the top. And depending how you measure it has to do with precision. So one of the things is that it was discovered in machine learning that you don't really have to compute with 64-bit numbers. You can compute with smaller numbers. And so this computer might actually be, you know, 2 or 4 times slower than it looks because it has less precision. But that's still 100 times less machines for the same sort of thing. Yet between 25 and 100 times less machines. So this is an incredible step forward. Now, there are huge computing problems, like the SKA telescope or the upgrade at CERN, where I think these sort of systems are sort of the answer. Yeah, they have a performance advantage that is really that step ahead that is missing at the moment. But it's difficult to convince people to buy new technology. Yeah, this is it's risky to do this maybe, and you might have to talk with Google. Also, as we've seen with every topic in this talk, it's coming, but it's maybe not completely there. Yeah, so do we have all the operations? Yeah, do we perhaps need slightly more general chips to make this work? Yeah, and so that's sort of the theme of this talk is there is in every direction, from building surrogates to building software to building hardware, yeah, to understanding the mathematics. It's all beginning, yeah, but it is all also very, very exciting. So I think that we've reached the end of the talk here, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions.
So once you've computed a distribution with machine learning, you usually want to evaluate the quality of the solution. Does that fundamentally differ for machine learning and for traditional simulations? For example, you said that it's not so clear what's happening on the way in mathematical description, so you might not be aware of all the inaccuracy of the machine learning approach.
Let me repeat your question so that it goes into the microphone. So you said with machine learning, if you apply inference, you would like to know how accurate is the result. And the question is that, do you actually know that or maybe not? And is it very different from that same question applied to simulation? First of all, this is an extremely good question where the answer is a little bit involved. The machine learning community has taken a statistical approach mostly to determining the accuracy of the outcome. So they talk about samples and how well the trained networks represent themselves on a test sample. So when they have a collection of things to work with, they first train, like with some of the initial cosmology data, and then they test afterwards what the accuracy is in a case where you have that control data that you are talking about. Yeah, and that's how machine learning perspective is mostly on the accuracy. For simulations, the story is much more complicated. So in principle, numerical analysis provides quite a few guarantees about how accurate the evolution may be. But that breaks down in multiple directions in reality. So first of all, floating point numbers and so on, almost nothing is known about the errors. Yeah, and when you ask computer scientists how do we verify that computation with floating point numbers, which are not real numbers, you see they have a limited precision, are good, they say, well, I'll run it a few times and yeah, so a terrible answer, yeah, and to some degree. But secondly, these methods from the numerical analysis community don't apply to very complicated equations. Yeah, not to the plasma equations. There's probably never been an analysis of the Zeldovich equations, even, yeah, of how accurate they are. So, to a large degree, the simulation community is also, is the right word to say, flying by the seats of their pants or something like that? Yeah, the accuracy there is, I think, largely unknown. But people do a lot of control experiments, yeah, like run a more refined simulation and so on, but it is an experimental sort of thing.
With the oval, you seem to be giving an example of a machine learning algorithm going beyond its training set, which I never heard that they could do. So what's known about how well you can do something that wasn't in the training set, predicting?
By the way, you said first with the...
Well, you talked about the training on a sphere. But
with the oval, yes. Okay, so the question is, if you have a machine learning model, how might it generalize, yeah, and what might it discover that you didn't feed into it from the ground up? By the way, let me first of all say that the cosmologists also found something very interesting. So there are actually constraints in this initial data coming from the Big Bang. These are the cosmological parameters of the early universe. And they varied those, and the model remained remarkably stable. So they got also correct answers by varying some of those parameters. So there's no real knowledge about that. But the intuition that I think people have is the following, that if you've built a good model, it has learned a law. It has not adapted to the data that you fed it, yeah, but it has actually got a fairly deep, subtle structure of going from step A to step B. And it may be that in quite a few cases, the generalizability is quite good. Yeah, but I think almost nothing is known about it as a theorem or even as a list of examples. I'm just telling you what I've picked up.
So it's a good guessing machine.
Indeed, yes, maybe, yeah. Boy, I hope I'm fair in pointing at people. Let me take somebody from the back.
Yeah, I want to continue this one. I mean, it's interesting to say that here that very little is known about the ability to extrapolate when you could train a network to learn simple momentum conservation of a certain class and then see whether it spots momentum conservation on a different class, as in, to answer that question doesn't look like it's very far away, at least for examples. So what stops people from going in this direction of how generalizable is the answer of a machine? How much has it learned the law instead of approximating the data?
Okay, so my impression is that nothing should stop people, but what I've seen is that there are two kinds of machine learning groups. Some people want to get really new results with machine learning, like the plasma guys and the cosmology guys. They're not really interested in these foundational questions. And then the foundational questions are at the moment in a part of the mathematics community that is maybe focused on some other problems related to machine learning. There are so many, suddenly emerging, and so a few have escaped attention. But I think, just like you say, nothing should be stopping people from studying this as a discipline more than using it as a tool. Yeah, it clearly has the status of a discipline, but it's young. Yeah. But let me, before I did we get questions on YouTube that are important? I'll take your question while he checks. Yeah.
It's just a question about the hardware again. So a quick comment actually. So I think another advantage of the TPU is that it's very power efficient, right? So something like 100 times more power efficient than the CPU. So that's another big cost saving.
Yeah.
But the question is, I mean, the last time I read about these, Google weren't selling them. So I'm just wondering, is that still the case? And if so, what hardware can scientific computers?
Okay, so first of all, let me make a shameless piece of advertisement. I'm running another seminar in the computer science department on Wednesdays that actually looks at new hardware and the software for it. And we will have companies coming from Google, speakers coming from Google and other accelerator companies. So there are hundreds of these companies that have chips in development, and some will be for sale. Even Google is actually selling something called the Edge TPU for £75 or some ridiculous price. You get a whole teraflop, and it looks beautiful. You plug it into USB-C, or you get a little development board. Yeah, so there is some form of availability. But there's also another question. Is it very important whether you can buy it or not? Why not just run this stuff in their data centers? I mean, finally, you can buy an Intel chip. Can you change anything inside it? No, it's an unmodifiable piece for which you pay lots of dollars. Yeah, so I think this question is quite complicated, and there will be hardware available. Yeah, and but maybe we don't even need to buy it.
A follow on to that, Peter. So I'm sure you're right for many cases, but of course there are cases where one would need to buy it. If you think, you give the example of the trigger for the LHC experiments, and there is a big latency issue. You have to deal with the data right at the spot where it's being
That's right.
produced.
Yeah.
So I think both cases will be populated with.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, to some degree, CERN is a rather unique experiment. Yeah, and so for example, for SKA, the number of machines that you really would need to buy are only the correlators in the desert. Yeah, and the remainder could run in an Amazon center or a Google center. Yeah, so I think it depends, of course. Yeah.
May I ask you as a follow-up to this question about the going beyond the training set and proposing oval targets? So, is it actually true that oval targets are better? Have they then confirmed that they're better? Or are they simply saying our machine learning thing is telling us that they're better?
I think at the moment it's just what you said. The second thing is it's a few months old, all this stuff. Yeah, I've been telling you about 2019 results. Yeah, this is all sort of almost still in flux. The third answer is, I wouldn't say that, but the person from the lab would say, I can tell you, but I'd have to kill you.
So, but we are presumably in suspense about that now.
Indeed,
right? Because it's not really a result until we know that it was true.
It's not an experimental result, completely true. Yeah, so it has been confirmed with simulation.
Oh, it has been confirmed.
With simulation, but not with a real experiment. Yeah, so there's all these aspects. So yeah, remember we have the machine learning.